You probably think you know this story. A severely disfigured boy, his wild biker mother, a tear-jerking Hollywood film, and Cher in leather delivering one of the most emotional performances of the 1980s. But the real story behind that film is far more complicated, and far less polished, than what audiences saw on screen. Before the cameras, before the awards, before the legend took shape, there was a real boy named Roy Lee Rocky Dennis and a mother whose life defied every stereotype. And before she died, Florence "Rusty" Tullis spoke candidly about her son, her choices, and the movie that made them famous in a way few people were prepared to hear. Rocky was born on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California. As an infant he seemed fragile but otherwise ordinary, suffering frequent ear and sinus infections. Then, around age 2, doctors noticed abnormalities in his skull during routine imaging. After months of testing at UCLA, the diagnosis came: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia, an extraordinarily rare disorder in which calcium deposits cause the skull bones to thicken and expand. The condition gradually distorts facial features and compresses the brain, often leading to blindness, neurological decline, and early death. At the time, doctors believed only a handful of cases had ever been documented. They told Rusty that her son would likely be blind, severely impaired, and dead before age 7. Rusty refused to accept that prognosis. She fought doctors, schools, and anyone who tried to limit Rocky's life. When specialists said he wouldn't be able to read because of poor eyesight, she insisted he try anyway. When schools attempted to move him into special education, she pushed back, arguing that his mind was intact. And Rocky proved her right. He developed a reputation for humor, warmth, and resilience that drew people toward him rather than pushing them away. Screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan would later say that Rocky's personality was what made the story worth telling in the first place. To understand Rusty's approach, you have to understand who she was before Rocky was born. Raised in Brooklyn, she was rebellious from an early age, truant from school, immersed in biker culture, and fiercely independent. She dropped out as a teenager, married young, had a son from her first marriage, and eventually moved west. By the time Rocky arrived, she had already formed a personal philosophy rooted in willpower. She believed people could influence their own health through determination. When Rocky suffered headaches or pain, she would send him to his room and tell him to make yourself well. To some, that sounded harsh. To her, it was empowering. She believed she was teaching him not to see himself as doomed. Her social circle reflected that unconventional outlook. Rusty rode motorcycles and associated with a tight-knit group of bikers who became an extended family for Rocky. They were rough around the edges but fiercely loyal, and they accepted the boy without hesitation. The film would later soften this world for mainstream audiences, portraying it as colorful but essentially safe. In reality, it was chaotic, loud, and unapologetically non-traditional. Rusty was open about her partying lifestyle and drug use, insisting it was simply part of the culture she lived in rather than a coping mechanism for grief. When Mask premiered in 1985, directed by Peter Bogdanovich and starring Eric Stoltz as Rocky, audiences embraced it as an inspirational story about love and acceptance. The film grossed tens of millions of dollars. Rusty, however, received only a modest payment for the rights to her story, much of which reportedly went toward medical care for her older son, Joshua, who was battling AIDS. To Rusty, the movie was not a financial windfall but a means to support her family. Her reaction to the film surprised reporters. Rather than expressing simple gratitude, she described it as a fairy tale. She appreciated Cher's performance and acknowledged that it captured her personality, but she felt the movie shifted focus away from Rocky's courage and toward her own dramatic life. She had expected a tribute to her son. Instead, she found herself portrayed as a central figure, almost an anti-hero. She also pointed out factual changes, including the compression of years into a short timeline and the omission of Joshua entirely. For Rusty, that omission was especially painful because Joshua remained a vital part of her life. Music became another point of contention. Rocky had adored Bruce Springsteen, and the film was originally built around his songs. When licensing issues forced the studio to replace them with tracks by Bob Seger, Rusty bluntly remarked that her son probably didn't even know who Seger was. It was a small detail, but to her it symbolized how Hollywood reshaped reality to fit commercial needs. The most painful divergence between film and reality involved Rocky's death. In September 1978, at age 16, his health declined sharply. Years of bone growth had taken their toll, and the headaches he had endured since childhood became unbearable. One evening after dinner out with family and friends, he returned home in severe pain. Rusty followed the same approach she had used throughout his life. She told him to go to his room and rest to make himself well. He died in his sleep that night, having outlived his predicted lifespan by nearly a decade. The movie depicts Rusty discovering his body herself in a devastating scene. In reality, she was not home at the time. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with legal trouble when her partner called with the news. The difference doesn't change the tragedy, but it highlights how the film reshaped events for emotional impact. Rusty never publicly framed her parenting philosophy as a mistake. She maintained that believing in Rocky's strength had given him a fuller life than he would otherwise have had. Joshua's story deepens the tragedy. Diagnosed with AIDS in the mid-1980s, he died in 1987, leaving Rusty to mourn both of her sons. Friends recalled that she remained outwardly defiant, insisting she did not believe in death as an ending. After Rocky's passing, she moved to San Francisco, embraced Buddhism, and worked with addicts and terminally ill patients, channeling her chaotic past into something resembling service. Even in later life, Rusty never became conventional. She continued riding motorcycles and living on her own terms. In 2006, at age 70, she was seriously injured in a motorcycle accident when a wheel came loose and she crashed into a pole. She survived the initial trauma but later died from complications. Those who knew her said she faced the end with the same stubborn independence that had defined her life. So what does this story ultimately mean? Rocky Dennis lived nearly 17 years with a condition that doctors believed would end his life before childhood. He attended school, made friends, fell in love, studied the night sky, and refused to hide from the world. He even questioned the idea of surgery to alter his face, asking who he would see in the mirror afterward. He chose authenticity over conformity. Rusty, meanwhile, was never a conventional hero. She was messy, controversial, sometimes reckless, but undeniably devoted. She fought institutions, protected her son's dignity, and built a community that accepted him completely. In the end, Rocky died at home, not in a hospital, surrounded by the life he had known rather than machines. Rusty had promised him that much. She died decades later, still defiant, still unconventional, still unwilling to apologize for who she was. The movie gave audiences a powerful emotional narrative, but the real story is more complex. Less tidy, more human, and far harder to categorize. If you love the scandals, rivalries, and secrets behind Hollywood's biggest legends, subscribe to Hollywood Feuds.